Hello. Hello. Hi guys, thank you for joining the live stream. Second time today. This paper is going to be extremely fun. This is just a short 17-page paper. Many of you all have heard of Suraj Yengde. Those who have heard of Rajiv Malhotra or has read any of his books or follows him on Twitter knows who Suraj Yengde is. And many of you all have heard of something called the Afro-Dalit Alliance. The claim is that casteism is problematic or oppressive in the exact same way that racism is problematic and exists, and their reasons for existence is also the same. That is the claim with these people and with this ideology. Here we have a paper from 2018 written by someone called Dr. Jesus Francisco Chairez Garza. He is a professor of history of ethnicities and race at University of Leeds, UK. I think this paper is a little old when he was in University of Leeds. Now he's in University of Manchester, okay? The topic is B.R. Ambedkar and Franz Boas, another anthropologist, and their rejection of racial theories of untouchability, okay? These people are of the opinion that their race has absolutely nothing to do with untouchability. So in a sense, this paper kind of debunks or kind of proposes that Ambedkar was debunking or at least opposing the Aryan invasion theory, or that theory having to do with anything when it came to casteism or untouchability, okay? As far as I can guess from reading the abstract, okay? So we are basically live reacting to this paper, so this will be fun. Let's see. Shail Sharma is saying, hey, Dr. Ambedkar didn't believe Dalits were Hindus, even called Dalits like Jagjivan Ram, Congress paid agent. I see, okay. Linguist, hi. S. Paul, hi. S. Paul is the mysterious right-leaning sociologist who has sent us this paper, of whom, whose papers we have discussed twice on this channel. Okay, so the abstract says, the paper analyzes Ambedkar's challenge to racial theories of untouchability. It examines how Franz Boas' ideas about race via Alexander Goldenweiser influenced Ambedkar's political thought. Ambedkar is situated as a thinker aware of larger changes taking place in Western academia in the early 20th century. During his time at Columbia University, Ambedkar familiarized himself with ideas that rejected the fixity of identities and racial hierarchies. Following Boas, he rejected the idea that the untouchables' place in society was determined by their supposed racial inferiority. Instead, he argued that untouchability was a cultural problem that could be stamped out, okay? Exactly. And this idea that he rejected fixity of identities, and that is the biggest lie that has been sold to us, that casteism is impossible to solve and the oppression has been going on for so long because apparently the castes are rigid, which they are not. Now we know, especially from the last few papers we have discussed. This paper analyzes B.R. Ambedkar's challenge to racial theories of untouchability. I pay particular attention to how Franz Boas' ideas about race via Alexander Goldenweiser influenced Ambedkar's political thought. So, situating Ambedkar as a thinker aware of larger changes taking place in Western academia in the first half of the 20th century, at this time there was an abandonment of positivist theories that located social sciences as a continuation of natural sciences. In short, positivism had explained the world through natural laws that would fit any given society despite specific contexts or cultures. This thinking had informed notions of racial superiority and evolutionist theories. Throughout the world, but at the turn of the 20th century, it had been challenged by important scholars at Columbia University such as John Dewey and Franz Boas. By linking Ambedkar's writing with Boas, I show that during his time as a student at Columbia, Ambedkar familiarized himself with ideas that rejected the fixity of identities, societal and racial hierarchies. Throughout the essay, I show how, at different stages in his career, Ambedkar put into practice concepts similar to those used by Boas in order to condemn the practice of untouchability. In other words, Ambedkar rejected the idea that the identity and place in society of untouchables were determined by their supposed racial inferiority. Okay, let's see what the footnote says. The legacy of Dewey's ideas for Ambedkar has been studied by several authors, including Arun P. Mukherjee, John Dewey, and okay. Instead, Ambedkar emphasized the importance of culture, which in Boa's vision included the environment, psychology, and language elements that were key in the construction of identities and societies. Ambedkar adopted this mode of thinking to argue that untouchability was not fixed or hereditary, but was a cultural problem that could be fought and eradicated. The essay is divided into 4 sections. First, I give a brief introduction to the intellectual context wherein Boas was writing against positivist and naturalist understandings of society. Second, I turn to Ambedkar's rejection of racial theories of caste. Here I claim that he was inspired by the work of Boas. Rejecting racial theories allowed Ambedkar to attack caste and untouchability in a way that was different from other Indian leaders such as Jyotirao Phule and M.C. Raja. Okay, Jyotirao Phule was of the opinion that because Aryan invasion theory happened, because it was so believable and because it was so obviously correct, therefore these people were, or the lower castes or the so-called indigenous people were oppressed because everyone else was an outsider racially. Third, I show how Ambedkar constructed an argument that highlighted how the structures of individuals or groups in societies were determined by the cultural and psychological circumstances surrounding them. Ambedkar believed that untouchability could be overcome through cultural change, such as conversion. While still influenced by a Boasian notion of culture, the third section also shows some of the intellectual breaks between Ambedkar and Boas, in particular the differences in their understanding of psychology and its role in social change. Although the claim that conversion gets rid of casteism is absolutely has been proven false in hindsight. Finally, the last section offers some concluding remarks and points to new connections between modern anthropology, Ambedkar's thought, and the field of global intellectual history. Anthropology, Ambedkar, and Boas via another scholar called Golden Weiser. Ambedkar's unique analysis of untouchability came from his years as a student at Columbia University in the USA. Ambedkar's decision to go to America was unusual. At the time, Indians studying abroad usually preferred to go to Britain. American academia was gaining importance in this period, and furthermore, the borders of academic disciplines such as sociology, psychology, and anthropology were being redefined in America in a very different way than in Britain and its colonies. It is in this context that Ambedkar's academic genealogy becomes relevant. With the support of the Gaikwad of Baroda, Ambedkar arrived in New York in 1913. What's the caste of the Gaikwad surname? Ambedkar arrived in New York in 1913, where he found an exciting intellectual milieu. As noted by Eleanor Zelliot, Columbia University was in its golden age. Important figures such as James Shotwell, Edwin Seligman, John Dewey, and Franz Boas were working at Columbia and were on their way to leaving a permanent mark on American academia. The most prominent of these intellectuals were Dewey and Boas. Dewey gained worldwide prominence with his writings about pragmatism, while Boas became widely known as the father of modern anthropology and set a trend in the way communities across the globe were to be studied. More book suggestions in the footnotes. While there have been numerous works focusing on Ambedkar and Dewey, not much has been written about the intellectual relationship between the two men. Although in a recent article, Gabriel Torres Colon and Charles Hobbs noted that Boas and Dewey had common intellectual interests. Their work acknowledged each other and dealt with similar issues. Dewey and Boas even co-taught a seminar at Columbia in 1914 to 1915. Torres Colon and Hobbs also show that there was an intellectual interbreeding between Dewey's pragmatism and Boas anthropology, tracing how various American anthropologists of the Boasian school were influenced by Dewey pragmatism. Shifting the focus away from Western intellectual history, I trace the way that Ambedkar's rejection of race as a determinant of social hierarchy exhibits the influence of Boas. This will bring a new perspective to the way Ambedkar's ideas about untouchability have been studied so far, and pave the way to make larger connections between Ambedkar and other intellectuals, apart from nationalist leaders such as Gandhi, with whom he is usually associated. Ambedkar was a student at Columbia University from 1913 to 1916. His main area of study was economics, but he did not limit himself to this discipline. His student records show that he also took courses in sociology, politics, philosophy, history, and even 2 courses in anthropology that lasted a full academic year. From 1915 to 1916, he attended the courses general ethnology, primitive man and physical environment, and general ethnology, primitive religion, mythology, and social organization, led by Alexander Goldenweiser. It is here that we can establish a connection between Ambedkar and Bose because Goldenweiser was one of Bose's first generation of students. After working at Columbia under Bose, Goldenweiser left to establish the anthropology department at the New School for Social Research in Manhattan. There, he taught prominent figures of modern anthropology such as Ruth Benedict and Leslie White, who, like Ambedkar, questioned the importance of racial theories throughout their work. Questioned. Goldenweiser's life work focused on Native Americans, particularly on the Iroquois tribe, and he wrote extensively on issues regarding anthropological methods. His writings reflected a great many of the ideas of his mentor, Franz Boas. In the early 20th century, Boas was changing the way anthropology was being practiced. He compiled most of his ideas in the book The Mind of Primitive Man, 1911, in which he challenged the racial stereotypes of the day that attributed fixed mental and physical characteristics to specific races. He rejected evolutionist theories and highlighted the importance of history, culture, and psychology in human life. Boas believed that culture encompassed material, social, and symbolic realms of life, arguing that there were multiple cultures in the world which were historically specific and linked to particular circumstances. For instance, he attributed the worldwide political dominion of Europeans to numerous factors, including the technological advances made in Europe that rested on knowledge that had been developed by other cultures around the world. Okay, listen to this sentence. If a Hindutvadi said this, they would be called a graduate from WhatsApp University. Okay, let's check out this sentence once again. How to highlight, yeah. Technological advances made in Europe that rested on the knowledge that had been developed by other cultures around the world. He claimed that the decline and eventual colonization of groups such as the indigenous populations of the American continent were linked to germs and disease. Yes, massive famines and plagues has wiped out large sections of the population because they were not immune to the particular diseases brought by Columbus and his ilk. He claimed that the decline and eventual colonization of groups such as the indigenous populations of the American continent were linked to germs and disease, rather than to racial superiority or a more advanced state of evolution. For Boas, quote, historical events appear to have been much more potent in leading races to civilization than their innate faculty. And it follows that achievements of race do not, without further proof, warrant the assumption that one race is more highly gifted than another. In other words, human difference was fundamentally cultural rather than racial. And similarly, different cultures did not represent a timeline of the stages of development of human civilization. Boas's paradigm thus had two main threads. The first was historical, tracing processes that explained the distribution of cultural traits. The second thread was psychological, focusing on how different cultures shaped the minds of individuals and how different cultural traits fitted together. Boas's criticism of racial theories of civilization, theories of civilization can be found throughout his work. Of particular importance was his rejection of racial theories justifying antisemitism. Being Jewish himself, Boas had experienced the type of discrimination both in Germany and in the United States. One of his more forceful arguments against antisemitism came when he participated in the United States Immigration Commission of 1907, which investigated the impact of immigration on American values and culture, based on the work of scientific racial theoreticians such as Daniel G. Brinton and A.H. Keene. The commission produced a quote-unquote dictionary of races to classify people entering the United States. It concluded that immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe was dangerous and should be restricted. Opposing the general views of the commission, Boas wrote a report rejecting anti-Semitic theories of race, which was later published as quote-unquote changes in bodily form of descendants of immigrants and became a landmark in Boas' career. In it, he emphatically rejected the proposition that Jewish population had been racially isolated from other groups around the world. To prove his point, he compared the physical characteristics of Jewish immigrants and their offspring. He concluded that American-born descendants of immigrants differed in type from their foreign-born parents. Yes. And he attributed such differences to the quote unquote influence of American environment. Exactly. In particular, he claimed that the head measurements of Jewish children in America were very different from those of Jewish infants in Europe. The food habit is even different. The climate is different. In both cases, the head measurements of Jewish children were similar to the rest of the juvenile population in which they lived. This argument is of particular importance for our purpose because, as shown later, Ambedkar rejected the racial inferiority of untouchables along the same lines as Boas refuted the racial inferiority of Jews. 20 years later, when the ideology of Aryanism became triumphant in Germany, Boas made his case against scientific racism even clearer. In an article entitled Aryans and Non-Aryans, he criticized the Nazi ideology that asserted that the Aryan race had quote-unquote certain biologically determined qualities which are entirely foreign to every non-Aryan, end quote. For Boas, the term Aryan was pure, which we know is horseshit, but commies of India don't know, and not do the Dravidians. For Boas, the term Aryan was purely a linguistic one. Exactly. Conrad Else would love it. And even Ambedkarites don't know that this is the case. For Boas, the term Aryan was purely a linguistic one. It did not relate to racial difference. Quote, Aryan is anyone who speaks an Aryan language, Swede as well as American Negro or Hindu. The core of Boas' argument was that there was no such thing as a pure race because history showed that extensive human migrations had occurred since the glacial period. He highlighted Spain, where there had been widespread mixing of Iberians, Phoenicians, Celts, Romans, Moors, and Jews. Similar conditions, he argued, were present across Europe. He concluded that it was a fiction to speak of a so-called German race. Boas also highlighted the absence of a connection between physical and mental characteristics. This was a direct challenge to the notion that Caucasians were mentally superior to people of African descent, something even Kant believed in. Boas accepted that the various regions and peoples of the world had different mental characters, quote unquote, but that these were not related to race. On the contrary, he explained that mental characteristics depended on the quote unquote unifying cultural bond which unites the people, and that language and customs played a vital role in the creation of these bonds. Oh, you don't say. This idea of culture brought an aspect of impermanence to the notion of identity because cultural bonds were learned or could be changed. Regardless of descent, anyone could adapt, learn, and feel another culture as their own, leading to his view that a nation was not, quote, defined by its descent but by its language and customs. Exactly. This was a common phenomenon in Europe. Boas wrote that just as Germanized Slavs and French have become German in their culture, as the Frenchified Germans have become French, the Russianized ones have become Russian, so have the German Jews become Germans. He concluded that through Aryan ideology, the Nazi government was trying to justify on scientific grounds their attitude towards the Jews, but the science upon which they are building their policies is a pseudoscience. In short, Boas denied the links between race and nation, making culture the key element in the formation of communities rather than race. The concept of cultural bonds, quote unquote, highlighted by Boas is paramount. Cultural bonds. It will be shown later that, like Boas, Ambedkar adopted the conception of culture as fluid. Ambedkar adopted the conception of culture as fluid, in that he rejected the notion that the untouchables were racially inferior to the rest of the Indian population. In contrast to Boas, however, Ambedkar did not consider quote-unquote languages and customs to be vital in the formation of a mental character. First, Ambedkar knew that the untouchables were not a homogeneous group, but that they had different languages and customs depending on their location in India. Thus, their cultural bonds could not bring them together socially. Second, many of the customs practiced by the untouchables had Hindu elements, which meant that efforts to justify their place in society could be found by recourse to religion. So, rather than relying on language and customs, Ambedkar emphasized the mental and psychological aspects of the construction of identity, such as race and caste. The rejection of race as a determinant of social structure also played an important part in the work of Goldenweiser. Similar to Boas, Goldenweiser considered that human behavior was primarily determined by cultural differences. Human behavior was primarily determined by cultural differences learned through social interaction. He explained how such beliefs in race or in notions such as racism and anti Semitism were not determined by birth but socially acquired. Quote, this is Goldenweiser's own quote. Prejudice, racial prejudice, is a group phenomenon, a social phenomenon. It is based on traditional backgrounds and is inculcated unconsciously into us early in life, before we know what is happening. And we cannot get rid of it unless we become, to a great extent, individualists, independent thinkers, persons who can stand on their own feet intellectually and emotionally, who are detached and capable of viewing things, quote unquote, above the battle. Goldenweiser's critique of race represents the line defended by him and Boas. Quote, it so happens that race is not merely a physical fact, is not merely a psychological fact, and in both these capacities we might as well disregard it on this occasion, but race today has once more, as so often before, become a state of mind. Race is a state of mind, it is an attitude, we are replete with it. In the 1930s, Ambedkar too would define caste as a state of mind. If we assume that Ambedkar was exposed to such ideas during his course at Columbia, then to what extent did the Boas-Goldenweiser rejection of the fixity of race influence his arguments against the racial inferiority of the untouchables in India? At the turn of the 20th century, racial explanations of caste were widespread both in India and in Europe, supported by the work of important intellectuals such as Max Weber and colonial ethnographers such as Herbert Risley. The work of the latter, Herbert Risley, was particularly influential in India. Risley's main thesis was that castes had originated from the racial differences between Indo-Aryans and Dravidians. The Indo-Aryans had quote-unquote, subdued the inferior race, established themselves as conquerors, and captured women according to their needs. Baapre. So this is what Jyotirao Phule believed in. After breeding enough females to serve their purposes, he argued, the Indo-Aryans had closed their ranks to all further intermixture of blood. क्या कहाँ से मिला भाई, ये तो पढ़ना होगा. According to Risley, this marked the birth of the caste system. He was convinced that the quote-unquote principle upon which the system rests is the sense of distinctions of race indicated by differences of color. What horseshit. Furthermore, he saw a connection between race and the structures of societies. Following the work of Topinard and Broca, he claimed that a broad nose was a marker of racial inferiority and backwardness, and that this was also true in terms of caste. Risley held that upper castes had a smaller nasal index than lower castes. Quote, if we take a series of castes in Bengal, Bihar, the United Provinces of Agra and Awadh or Madras, and arrange them in the order of the average nasal index, so that the caste with the finest nose shall be at the top, and that with the coarsest at the bottom of the list, it will be found that his order substantially corresponds with the accepted order of social precedence. Thus, in Bihar or the United Provinces, the casteless tribes, Kols, Kodwas, Mundas, and the like, who have not yet entered the Brahmanical system, occupy the lowest place in both series. Okay, I don't know how English grammar works here. He just said that they are outside that system, but also said they are lowest in the system. How the fuck do these two concepts work together at the same time? How are these two both true, both correct at the same time? Either you are in the system, therefore high and low in the hierarchy, or you are outside the system, therefore your position in the hierarchy is irrelevant because you are not even in the hierarchy. पंचमाज को बोल रहा है कि लो है, ऊपर है, नीचे है. Then come the vermin-eating Musahars and the leather-dressing Chamars. The fisher castes, Bauri, Bind and Kewat are a trifle higher in the scale. The pastoral Goala, the cultivating Kurmi, and a group of cognate castes from whose hands a Brahman may take water follow in due order, and from them we pass to the trading Khatris, the landholding Babhans, and the upper crust of Hindu society. In short, Risley attributed a lower caste status to an inferior racial background. Such beliefs posed a challenge to Ambedkar, who needed to show that the untouchables were not inherently inferior to the rest of Indian society. To do this, he needed to find an alternative so that he could discard the racial theories of the time. Now, a new subchapter begins, Ambedkar, Race and Caste. Now, let me have a sip of coffee and check some comments. Ambedkar was pure reactionist. He went to find homogeneous caste-based discrimination in India, but was shocked when he did not find the uniformity and hence hid all the counter views and facts in books. I see. sometimes even more than the Central and Northwest Asians where the supposedly Aryans came from. कुछ नहीं, बस वही बकते रहे जो उनको Christian missionaries बकते रहे. They are talking about Chandals. What was obsession with giving water to Brahmins? This is wrong as per formal logic and discrete maths. Ambedkar, race and caste. Ambedkar did not wait long to use the new anthropological ideas he had learned at Columbia. In 1916, he presented his paper Castes in India, Their Mechanism, Genesis and Development in Golden Wiser's course, which attempted to explain the origin of caste. Not surprisingly, his essay reflected some of the main features of the Boasian school of thought. In particular, Castes in India reads as a vehement rejection of the use of racial theories to explain the caste system. From the beginning of the paper, Ambedkar downplayed the importance of race in India, noting that the people of the subcontinent were quote, a mixture of Aryans, Dravidians, Mongolians and Scythians. Okay, so Dravidian Ambedkarites have not received the memo, I guess. This made racial differences irrelevant because, quote unquote, quote, ethnically all people are heterogeneous in India. End quote. Ambedkar was also very careful to underscore that racial explanations, okay, the quote says ethnically all people are heterogeneous, end quote. I'm saying that, yeah, so in India that is the case, but Dravidians don't know this. Ambedkar was also very careful to underscore that racial explanations of the caste system were flawed and based on foreign conceptions of society. He argued that European students of caste have unduly emphasized the role of color in the caste system. Themselves impregnated by color prejudices, they very readily imagined it to be the chief factor in the caste problem. But nothing can be farther from the truth, end quote. This is Ambedkar's own quote. He continued to dismiss the ideas of Herbert Risley, one of the biggest exponents of the racial theories of caste, describing him as someone who, quote, makes no new point deserving of special attention, end quote. Furthermore, Ambedkar considered evolutionists and eugenic theories so absurd that, like Boas and Goldenweiser, he did not deign to discuss them in great detail. Quote from Ambedkar himself that, without stopping to criticize those theories that explain the caste system as a natural phenomenon occurring in obedience to the law of disintegration, as explained by Herbert Spencer in his Formula of Evolution, or as natural as the quote-unquote structural differentiation within an organism, to employ the phraseology of orthodox apologists, or as an early attempt to test the laws of eugenics, as all belonging to the same class of fallacy which regards the caste system as inevitable, or as being consciously imposed in anticipation of these laws on a humble population, I will now lay before you my own view on the subject. End quote. Instead, he highlighted the importance of culture and psychology in the genesis and development of caste, thus showing that caste was not immutable and could change over time. Ambedkar's thesis consists of 4 main points. First, he explained that despite the diverse nature of the Hindu population, India had a deep cultural unity. Second, he noted that caste was the parceling of a larger cultural unit into small pieces, made possible by making endogamy sacred to Hindu society. Endogamy was important because it was a way of preventing quote-unquote surplus women and surplus men abandoning their homes and joining another group that could potentially damage the original community. Thirdly, he defended the idea that there was only one caste, that of the Brahmins. He explained that before the caste system became widespread, the population of the subcontinent had been divided into classes. Finally, Ambedkar argued that the dissemination of caste in India could not be explained religiously by the creation of the laws of Manu, because the laws of Manu reflected practices already in existence in Indian society rather than imposing new practices. This is what I've been saying from even before I read the Manusmriti. This was just common sense according to me. I had not heard someone say this, but I was saying this anyway, that how can a society function by just one random Maharshi coming up with some rules? The society was obviously functioning on the basis of those or were considering them the norm anyway, okay? And someone just saw that, okay, this leads to great results or a stable society, and when someone does not follow these, it leads to big problems. So why not codify them into law? That's what I've been saying since the day I started my channel, and now I see that Ambedkar himself said this. What a weird thing. This is common sense, guys. It's not like there was no caste system or no casteism of any kind, and one fine morning a guy called Manu wakes up and says, "Hi guys, from today we have to follow something called caste system," and everyone says, "Oh, okay, okay. From today, this guy is superior to me. This guy is inferior to me." That's not how mankind works. Building on the ideas of Walter Begehot and French sociologist Gabriel Tard, he argued, now Ambedkar's quote, endogamy or the closed door system was a fashion in the Hindu society, and as it had originated from the Brahmin caste, it was wholeheartedly imitated by all the non-Brahmin subdivisions or classes who in their turn became endogamous castes. It is the infection of imitation, or following the aspirational model of whatever the rich and successful are doing. That it is that quote-unquote infection of imitation that caught all these subdivisions on their onward march of differentiation and has turned them into castes. The propensity to imitate is a deep-seated one in the human mind, obviously, and need not be deemed an inadequate explanation for the formation of the various castes in India. End quote. Thus, caste was neither racial, pre-social, nor fixed in time. According to Ambedkar, caste derived from the practice of endogamy, and it involved environmental, cultural, and psychological elements. It was specific to the culture of India and had spread through imitation. This meant that caste could be transformed or even unlearned. Ambedkar's essay on caste was sufficiently innovative to be published in the 1917 volume of Indian Antiquary, the journal founded by the Scottish archaeologist James Burgess. However, his use of anthropological ideas went beyond academia. He continued to use ideas inspired by Boas and Goldenweiser to reject the practice of untouchability in India and to distinguish himself from other politicians who claimed to represent untouchables. Ambedkar returned to India in 1924 with his remarkable educational credentials. He was soon noticed by the Mahar community in Bombay and by the colonial government that saw him as a potential political leader to counter the Congress's mass political movement. In 1927, he was nominated by the colonial government to serve as a representative of the depressed classes in the Bombay Legislative Council, remaining in that position for 10 years. This gave him a platform to disseminate his new views on caste and untouchability. Ambedkar's views on untouchability contrasted with mainstream explanations of the origin of untouchability in India. Former low-caste leaders like Jyotirao Phule 1827 to 1890 and M.C. Raja 1883 to 1943 argued that the untouchables were the original inhabitants of the subcontinent, part of a different race that was in need of protection after experiencing centuries of oppression from Aryan Hindu conquerors. Phule's work illustrates how racial theories of untouchability were alive and well even before Ambedkar's time. And we know now that Brahmo Samaj in fact pushed this idea because they thought they will get the extra nice treatment because they are Brahmins and therefore they are followers of the original Rig Veda, which was written by Aryans in some European steppe lands, and therefore they are more Christian adjacent. And then look how it fucking backfired. Phule emphasized that the low castes or Shudras and Atishudras had been conquered and then exploited by the foreign Aryan Brahmins. This is called pseudoscience and fake research, okay? So when this is done by the right wing also, remember what these things lead to, okay? This is just random imaginations. Some inferences are being drawn upon absolute horseshit research. The Aryan Brahmins established, this is a quote from Jyotirao Phule, the Aryan Brahmins established their own supremacy and domination over the original inhabitants here by conquering them in wars. The warlike Kshatriyas were enslaved and were given the pejorative name of Kshudra, insignificant, which later was corrupted into Shudra. End quote. Ambedkar was certainly aware of Phule's ideas. Even though Phule had died a year before Ambedkar was born, both men came from Western India and shared the same benefactors, the Gaikwad of Baroda, and Ambedkar dedicated his book Who Were the Shudras to the memory of Phule. The connections between Ambedkar and Phule made Ambedkar's rejection of the racial explanation of untouchability somewhat surprising. That whom he was mainly countering, उसी को book dedicate कर दिया. The idea that the untouchables did not belong to the Aryan race was also held by M.C. Raja, a seasoned Paraiyar politician who clashed with Ambedkar over the issue of separate electorates for the untouchables in the 1930s. Originally from Madras, now Chennai, Raja's career was linked to the education of the untouchables. He became a teacher in 1906 and founded a Dravidian school at Nugumbakkam in 1936. He was also involved in several education committees. Education committees in Madras. Raja was an active politician who firmly believed that the untouchables had a pre-Aryan origin. In the book called The Oppressed Hindus, a pamphlet published in 1925, he wrote that there was a racial difference between the untouchables he claimed to represent and their oppressors. He explained that in Madras, the depressed classes were in fact Adi Dravidas, the quote-unquote original inhabitants of the soil, who represented the earliest civilization of South India. They were a powerful community that had, quote, developed a complete civilization of their own with their democratic form of government, their fine arts and religion and philosophy of their own, end quote. However, the splendor of the Adi Dravida civilization had come to an end with the arrival of the Aryans. The people known as Dravidas had joined the ranks of the Aryans and been converted into caste Hindus, but the Adi Dravidas of South India had resisted the Aryan invasion and so were penalized. पूरा random कहानी बना रहा है. In his pamphlet, Raja described, this is just propaganda piece. In his pamphlet, Raja described how the Aryan invaders made servants of the Adi Dravidas who were barred from religious matters and from carrying arms. Furthermore, the Adi Dravidas, quote, were not only punished with social degradation but were also stigmatized as untouchables and unapproachables. End quote. According to Raja, the Adi Dravidas or untouchables were a community that could be distinguished racially from the main body of the Hindu population. At first glance, Phule's and Raja's theories about the origin of the untouchables do not seem that different from the ones propounded by Ambedkar in relation to Buddhism. In broad terms, the three of them suggested that at some point a large group of people had been deemed untouchables because they resisted Brahmanism or the Vedic Dharma. However, there are important differences that need to be highlighted. Phule and Raja argued that the untouchables were the original inhabitants of India, meaning that there was a racial difference between the Aryan conquerors and the non-Aryan victims. At a time when evolutionist theories had not been entirely discarded and when colonial officials like Risley often used racial arguments to legitimize their taking power, which was also used by Brahmo Samaj to legitimize their own insane actions. The connection between the connection Ambedkar drew between untouchability and Buddhism becomes more interesting. Defending the idea that the untouchables were Buddhists allowed Ambedkar to center his argument in a cultural rather than racial field and discard the idea that the untouchables were part of an inferior race conquered by Aryan invaders, which thus justified their position at the bottom of Indian society. That entire idea was rejected by Ambedkar. Ambedkar's rejection of racial theories of untouchability was consistent throughout his career, both in his politics and in his writings. For instance, in 1928, Ambedkar was called to make a submission to the Indian Statutory Committee, the Simon Commission, which had been appointed to investigate the constitutional future of India. Ambedkar gave evidence on the subject of the depressed classes. In May, he demanded adult franchise, joint electorates, and reserved seats for the untouchables. Even though his demands were not acknowledged by the commission, Ambedkar made it clear that he did not share the racial explanation of untouchability that M.C. Raja had defended a few days before. When Ambedkar was asked by John Simon if the untouchables were the original inhabitants of India, he refused to reply. Ambedkar says, "We cannot be deemed to be part of the Hindu community." Chairman John Simon says, "You come, I believe, from an earlier set of inhabitants of this continent." Ambedkar said, "That is one view, I think." Chairman says, "It is supposed, we will not go into details, that you are pre-Aryan." Ambedkar says, "Well, I do not know. That is a view." Ambedkar's participation in the Simon Commission is important for two reasons. First, it was the only time that Ambedkar argued for the untouchables to be part of the general electoral constituency, but only if universal franchise was granted. This demonstrates that he was committed to gaining recognition for the untouchables as a community with special needs for political representation, yet he was still not ready to make a break with the larger Hindu community. This is in 1928, guys. Second, the Simon Commission marked the decline of M.C. Raja as the most important representative of the untouchables in the eyes of the colonial government, thank God. After this, Ambedkar moved to the center stage of Indian politics and began to take part in various committees created to assert the problem of untouchability. And luckily, today, Narendra Modi is the main face of lower caste politics. During the roundtable conferences between 1930 and 1932, the question of the untouchables' political representation came to the fore. These conferences saw the clash of two conflicting visions regarding the past, present, and future of the untouchables and untouchability as national problems. First, M.K. Gandhi condemned the practice of untouchability but maintained that because the people classified as untouchables were actually Hindus, they should remain in this position and condition. The second view was submitted by Ambedkar, and in it, he adopted a different position than Bose regarding the importance of language and customs in the makeup of identity. Ambedkar claimed that despite common Hindu religious beliefs, the history of discrimination and segregation suffered by the untouchables made them an element apart from the larger Hindu community. So this is in 1932. In 4 years, he finally changed his mind. The recognition of this group as an independent political community was important politically for Ambedkar because it meant that the untouchables could claim separate electorates, thus denying caste Hindus the possibility of using politics as a powerful tool to dominate the lives of the untouchables. The British government supported Ambedkar, and in 1932, the depressed classes were granted special electoral protection in the form of the communal award, and these things were misappropriated and misused to come up with the Jai Bhim, Jai Meme movements of those days, which still go on today, which resulted in the first law minister of Pakistan, Jagannath Mandal, fleeing to come back to India, the country he divided, the country whose division he propagated. But he left behind all his followers and all his voters, the Dalits, to be slaughtered or converted at the hands of Muslims. But those people who went to Bangladesh or Pakistan because they thought it would be a land full of equality, where the oppressed Muslims and oppressed Dalits would hold hands and suck each other's dicks. But that did not happen. The British government supported Ambedkar, and in 1932, the depressed classes were granted special electoral protection in the form of the communal award. Gandhi did not accept this decision and began a fast in protest. फैट लॉस का बेस्ट प्रोसीजर ढूंढ लिया था गांधी ने. चलो कुछ भी हो जाए, आज एक फास्ट कर लेते हैं थोड़ा सा जल्दी से. Ambedkar reached an agreement with Gandhi after intense negotiations, resulting in the so-called Pune Pact, whereby the untouchables were to remain politically classified as Hindus and not as a political minority. Good. The demand for separate electorates for the untouchables was scrapped. As a result, Ambedkar's views of Hinduism became more radical. Okay, so this pissed off Ambedkar even more. Is there an important footnote? There were 3 conferences held in London to discuss constitutional reforms in India. They were organized after the nationalists rejected the findings of the 1928 Simon Commission. Among the issues to be discussed were whether India should be granted dominion status, whether diarchy was still a sustainable form of government, and the design of the Indian electorate. The conference was attended by British politicians and political and religious leaders from India, including from the princely states. Okay, let's see what M. Shastri is saying, and let me have some coffee. M. Shastri is saying, Dada, you should read up on Raja Munje Pact. It is similar to Pune Pact. Yeah, I've heard of that pact. Dada, Raja signed the precursor to Pune Pact with Hindu Mahasabha. I see. Madan Mohan Malviya used the pact signed with Raja to write Pune Pact. Okay. Okay, next. Now we go we fast forward to 3 more years. We fast forward 3 more years, and in 1935, Ambedkar decided to abandon Hinduism. He addressed some of his followers at a conference at Yeola in Maharashtra, uttering his now famous words, quote, "Unfortunately for me, I was born a Hindu untouchable. It was beyond my power to prevent that, but I declare that it is within my power to refuse to live under ignoble and humiliating conditions. I solemnly assure you that I will not die a Hindu." End quote. Gradually, Ambedkar turned to Buddhism as his religion of choice for the untouchables, while rejecting the 2 core tenets of Buddhism. From the mid-1930s until his death in 1956, he developed a theory that ancient Buddhists had been punished by Hindus and became untouchables, and these writings continued to reflect the influence of his years in America. For instance, in Annihilation of Caste, considered today as one of his seminal works, he rejected once again the racial origin of untouchability. Like Boas, he maintained that to treat caste differences as based on racial differences was a gross perversion of facts, and this debunks the entirety of Suraj Yengde's academic career, profession, his speaking fees, etc. Okay. He wrote, quote, "What racial affinity is there between the Brahman of the Punjab and the Brahman of Madras? What racial affinity is there between the untouchable of Bengal and the untouchables of Madras? What racial difference is there between the Brahman of the Punjab and the Chamar of the Punjab? What racial difference is there between the Brahmin of the Madras and the Pariah of Madras? The Brahmin of the Punjab is racially of the same stock as the Chamar of the Punjab, and the Brahmin of Madras is of the same race as the Pariah of Madras. Caste system does not demarcate racial division." R.I.P. Suraj Yengde's activism. Ambedkar also dealt with the question of the Aryan race in Who Were the Shudras, written in 1946. Following the work of W.Z. Ripley, Ambedkar took race to mean, quote, "a body of people possessing certain typical traits which are hereditary, genetic traits." Like most academics of the time, Ambedkar was not able to reject anthropometry altogether, yet he remained critical of the supposed racial division of the people of India. Although he still believed that the measurement of the human head was the only reliable way to determine race, he argued that caste was not racial. He stated, quote, "If anthropometry is a science which can be depended upon to determine the race of a people, then the result obtained by the application of anthropometry disproved that the untouchables belong to a race different from the Aryans and the Dravidians. The measurements established that the Brahmin and untouchables belong to the same race. Differences in human skulls were non-existent in India, and they certainly did not support the division of people into castes because of head sizes." As noted earlier, this argument was precisely the one used by Boas against anti-Semitic theories of race, in which he showed that the physical characteristics of Jewish children in America were more similar to the rest of the children in that country than to Jewish children in Europe. Untouchability as a cultural effect. Untouchability as a cultural conflict. Ambedkar's explanation of untouchability reflected the focus on culture and psychology defended in the works of Boas. Ambedkar argued that the problem of untouchability was the result of social and cultural conflicts. In The Untouchables, Who Were They and Why They Became Untouchables, 1948, Ambedkar gave a historical account of how untouchability arose in India in order to show that untouchability was not hereditary. Untouchability was not hereditary. Untouchability was not hereditary, ancestral, or fixed. Even the title, framed as a question, suggests that untouchability is not a permanent state and has an explanation. It also proposes that identity can change over time because the untouchables were something else before being condemned to untouchability. One of the main arguments of the untouchables is that the group once comprised broken men, stray members of tribes that had been defeated by stronger groups. Okay, Giridharan is saying this dude Suraj Yengde and Ambedkarites never talk about Ambedkar's views on Islam. Actually, they do. They have come to know about it now because that book, Partition or Pakistan of India, was basically unavailable in India for the last few decades. But now, since they now have read it, because Hindutwadis have propagated that book so much, now they're absolutely pissed off with Ambedkar, okay? But more importantly, they don't even read these views of Ambedkar, where he's rejecting caste rigidity, where he's rejecting the racial idea, any racial connotations with caste, etc. Okay. All of them are allied with Dravidians. According to Ambedkar, the broken men lived in separate quarters outside the village for the reason they belonged to a different tribe and therefore to different blood. Okay. So, untouchables is that the group once comprised broken men, stray members of tribes that had been defeated by stronger groups. After being routed, these broken men, meaning men who have broken away from the main tribe, established themselves near the villages of settled tribes and agreed to work as watchmen or wards in exchange for food and shelter. According to Ambedkar, the broken men lived in separate quarters outside the village for the reason they belonged to a different tribe and therefore to different blood. Despite the use of the term different blood, Ambedkar clarified that he was referring to kinship rather than race. Khun ka rishta, not literal blood. He went on to explain that the eventual categorization of broken men into untouchables was due to cultural conflict, namely that the settled communities were Hindus and followed a Brahmanical religious system, the Vedic system, while the broken men were Buddhists who did not revere the Brahmins, did not employ them as their priests and regarded them as impure. The broken men hated the Brahmins because they were the enemies of Buddhism. Okay, he's flipping the conversation entirely. He's saying that the broken men, the so-called lower castes, were the ones who hated Brahmins, because there are castes today who consider Brahmins as untouchables. Okay, if a Brahmin enters their house, they clean their entire house with Gomutra in southern India. And Ambedkar is kind of pointing that out. The broken men were Buddhists who did not revere the Brahmins, did not employ them as their priests, and regarded them as impure. The broken men, the so-called Buddhists, considered Brahmins impure. The broken men hated the Brahmins because they were the enemies of Buddhism. In return, the Brahmins imposed untouchability upon the broken men because they would not abandon Buddhism and ate beef. Okay, here, this is not an exact quote from Ambedkar, but so therefore it might not be fair to say that I am countering Ambedkar at the moment. But this logic kind of fails in itself, because let's say there are a group of Brahmins, there are a group of Brahmins who are being considered untouchable by Brahmins. But also Ambedkar is first claiming that those untouchables hate Brahmins. Those untouchables are the ones who dislike Brahmins for not being Buddhists or not being familiar with Buddhist customs. They are the ones who don't revere Brahmins. But then, one fine morning, if as a response to that, Brahmins say that from today you are untouchable, how did that get enforced into law? How did those untouchables or so-called Buddhists accept that law? That I think needs more questioning. Thus, one of the roots of untouchability lay in the hatred and contempt which the Brahmanical order felt for Buddhists and those who continued to eat beef. This enmity was part of a struggle for power that was later transformed into canon law once Brahmanism became stronger than Buddhism in India. But first of all, why did it become stronger than Buddhism in India? Secondly, what was it before it became stronger than Buddhism in India? So then, until then, untouchables and Brahmins were fighting on an equal footing then, or what? In other words, untouchability was the outcome of a cultural war. Quote of Ambedkar, that the object of the Brahmins in giving up beef eating was to snatch away from the Buddhist bhikshus the supremacy they had acquired is evidenced by the that the object of the Brahmins in giving up beef eating was to snatch away from the Buddhist bhikshus the supremacy they had acquired is evidenced by the adoption of vegetarianism by Brahmins. Why did the Brahmins become vegetarian? The answer is that without becoming vegetarian, the Brahmins could not have recovered the ground they had lost to their rival, namely Buddhism. In this connection, it must be remembered that there was one aspect in which Brahmanism suffered in public esteem as compared to Buddhism. That was the practice of animal sacrifice. Okay, I need to read this part once more because I know some things about this. In this connection, it must be remembered that there was one aspect in which Brahmanism suffered in public esteem as compared to Buddhism. That was the practice of animal sacrifice, which was the essence of Brahmanism and to which Buddhism was deadly opposed. That in an agricultural population there should be respect for Buddhism and revulsion against Brahmanism, which involved slaughter of animals including cows and bullocks, is only natural. What could the Brahmins do to recover the lost ground? To go one better than the Buddhist bhikshus, not only to give up meat eating but to become vegetarians, which they did. This is just a claim. It may or may not be true, but more importantly, then why did Shaktas never become vegetarians, or why did even Brahman Shaktas don't eat meat, do they? Or is it a transgression? I don't exactly know. Can someone correct me? That Shaktas are definitely proud goat eaters, but are Shakta Brahmins, or let's say the Purohits, supposed to eat meat, or they are supposed to live in the sattvic diet because their work is sattvic, whereas rajasic and tamasic people are the ones who will go around eating the goats. After dealing, end quote. After dealing with the cultural aspect of untouchability, Ambedkar turned to its psychological aspect. It is here that Ambedkar clearly broke intellectually with Boas. Following Dewey and to a lesser extent Goldenweiser, Ambedkar believed that psychology was closely linked to experience, and that this was key to the formation of individuals and communities. He was convinced that through meaningful experiences, individuals were able to question their conditions and change them. From this stance, Ambedkar's emphasis on education and religious conversion as ways to eliminate untouchability acquires a new meaning which did not really gain any fruit as we know now. By contrast, from an anthropological perspective, Boas was not interested in the psychology of individuals as such. Rather, he quote-unquote wanted to determine the psychological laws which control the mind of man everywhere, and that may differ in various racial and social groups. These tensions are understandable if we consider that Boas's main objective throughout his career was to understand different cultures, not necessarily to change them. His arguments remained largely in academia. Ambedkar, on the other hand, wanted to change the culture, the environment, and the politics he lived in. So this is sort of a analogous to the debate between Max Weber and C.W. Mills. For this to happen, the psychology of the untouchables themselves needed to change. It is important to emphasize here that Ambedkar was not the only intellectual of his time to find Boas's views on psychology inadequate. As noted by Torres Colon and Hobbes, Boas's other students such as Ruth Benedict, Alexander Lesser, and Jean Weltfish differed from their mentor in this matter. Beautiful. More importantly, like Ambedkar, the three of them found in John Dewey a way to address the shortcomings of Boas's thought. Lesser in particular used Dewey to emphasize the role of individual and social experience in the development of anthropology as a way to change intellectual currents and produce social change. So individual and social experience can produce social change and change intellectual currents. This sort of vision was also very clear in Ambedkar's right understanding of the psychological aspect of untouchability and its connection to social change. Since Ambedkar wrote Annihilation of Caste, he had argued that caste and untouchability were more than mere social practices because caste also had a psychological effect on people. It altered the way individuals behaved among others and how individuals or groups thought of themselves. This is true pretty much. In the same way as Goldenweiser had done years before, Ambedkar explained that caste was not a physical object like a wall of bricks or a line of barbed wire which prevents the Hindus from commingling and which has therefore to be pulled down. Caste is a notion, it is a state of the mind, and therefore lazy academics can't solve this problem, which most commies are, which is why they have not been able to solve this. This requires serious rigor, both on the ground and intellectually. In the same vein, सिर्फ ब्राह्मण्स को गाली देने से ये notion of a state of a mind खत्म नहीं होगा. In the same vein, in The Untouchables, Ambedkar described untouchability as an aspect of social psychology, a sort of social nausea of one group against another group, well said. Despite being a state of mind, the impact of caste and untouchability was transformed into psychological violence in the form of notions of purity and impurity and the division of society into high and low status. Belief in the religiously sanctioned division of society had prevented individuals from taking action against an oppressive system because these beliefs became part of the subconscious of Indian society. And let me give you some examples that this is so today, even today, and because of the same reasons. In USA, if you say that I have come up with a vaccine and I think you should take it, most people will laugh at you because they know that why should I trust you all of a sudden? Who the fuck are you? Whereas in India, everyone trusts anyone in authority so much, whether it's PhD academics, politicians, their general physicians who keep recommending them some medicine or the other that they are going to consume for the rest of their lives without actually treating their disease. So, the 180-degree opposite what happened in India when Corona came out was that immediately people started blaming the government for not having come up with a vaccine as of yet, okay? They were saying, where is the vaccine? Where is the vaccine? I want to take it right now. So that kind of a sheep, low inferiority complex mentality is not there in places where casteism has not been serious for not recently at least. And you see, that is also the reason why there is this notion that that job isn't for me, or that job might be too tough for me. This notion is going away very rapidly in the post 90s born kids, but that was not so in the previous generations because of socialism as well, because there were not too many jobs. But that idea that, yeah, I will try I will try my hand at that, I'll try my luck at that, let's see where this takes me. That sort of courageous mentality does not exist too much in Indians, rarely if so. And therefore you will see things like a famous singer, a famous podcaster, and a construction worker, a truck driver, training Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in the same gym at the same time. Like in Canada, in Firas Zahabi's MMA gym, George St. Pierre is every day in the gym practicing MMA with a beginner. If tomorrow you go to Canada and enter Firas Zahabi's gym, you will see the biggest MMA stars doing the same warm-ups with you, side by side. That sort of a thing has never happened here and still does not happen here. Not because of just the economics of it. Because obviously, let's say, if Shah Rukh Khan goes to a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu gym, I'm not going to be able to afford it. But even so, there is a gigantic inferiority complex among everyone, that someone is so much deserving of a respect that I do not need to go near him. That is absolutely because of India's specific way of casteism. And since that is not going away, there's no point blaming some Brahmins or Manu or Manusmriti. These are deep psychological issues that we need to solve. Belief in the religiously sanctioned division of society had prevented individuals from taking action against an oppressive system because these beliefs became part of the subconscious of Indian society. He wrote, quote, "But if a man is deprived of his liberty indirectly, he has no consciousness of his enslavement. Untouchability is an indirect form of slavery. To tell an untouchable, you are free, you are a citizen, you have all the rights of a citizen, and to tighten the rope in such a way as to leave him no opportunity to realize the ideal is a cruel deception. Therefore, socialism, communism is only going to exacerbate the problem. It is enslavement without making the untouchables conscious of their enslavement. It is slavery, though it is untouchability. It is real, though it is indirect. It is enduring because it is unconscious." The psychological aspect of untouchability, Ambedkar argued, led the untouchables and lower caste Hindus to believe that they were condemned to be plowmen and they never would be allowed to convert their plowshare into swords. Moreover, due to being denied education, they, that is low caste Hindus, could not think out or know the way to their salvation. They were condemned to be lowly, and not knowing the way to escape and not having the means of escape, they became reconciled to eternal servitude. Exactly what I was talking about right now, which frankly every caste has. Because today casteism doesn't exist in the same way as a few decades earlier. But today, casteism exists in today's professions exactly the way it existed back then, but not in the same caste in the hereditary sense. Okay, so the superiority felt by today's Brahmins, that is PhDs and academics, is the same as the superiority felt by upper castes of those days. But it doesn't necessarily have to be someone from a Brahmin in name family. Okay, some kid from a Brahmin in name only family. They are not going to have the superiority. But whoever is the superior today does the same sort of feudalist bullshit that is always accused of the upper castes of India. Lokavya, there are only 2 legit books on Savarkar. One is by Janki Bakle and one is by Vikram Sampath. Okay. They were condemned to be lowly, and not knowing the way to escape and not having the means of escape, they became reconciled to eternal servitude, which they accepted as their inescapable fate. Ambedkar's purpose in presenting untouchability as a psychological phenomenon was to make the untouchables aware that their social condition was not fixed or unavoidable. And today this psychological condition, this inferiority complex, exists in almost everyone in some context or the other, and we need to get fucking rid of it as soon as possible. Rather, he showed that untouchability was constantly being sustained through cultural and psychological violence. In order to eradicate it, the violence inherent in untouchability had to be exposed. Quote, No resistance to power is possible while the sanctioning lies which justify that power are accepted as valid. While the lie, which is the first and the chief line of defense, remains unbroken, there can be no revolt. Before any injustice, any abuse or oppression can be resisted, the lie upon which it is founded must be unmasked. The lie that PhDs are always right. The lie that your general physician is as knowledgeable of your nutrition as Arnold Schwarzenegger. Myths. Before any injustice, any abuse or oppression can be resisted, the lie upon which it is founded must be unmasked, must be clearly recognized for what it is. So unless you break those lies, those myths, you will never get rid of the elitism of the academics today. By such an exposure, Ambedkar aimed to show the untouchables a way for them to abandon untouchability and attain social and cultural liberation. Conclusion. From 1950 onwards, Ambedkar committed to his idea of abandoning Hinduism in favor of Buddhism, which is his own made up brand of Buddhism. His interest in converting to Buddhism was clear when he was invited to attend the World Buddhist Conference in Colombo in May 1950. Did he go to that conference and say that I'm going to change your religion completely and then convert to it? In 1954, Ambedkar announced that he was writing a book on Buddhism. 2 years later, he finished the manuscript of the Buddha and his Dhamma, although it was published only after his death. On 14th October 1956 in Nagpur, Ambedkar converted to Buddhism in a ceremony conducted by the oldest monk in India, the Burmese Bhikkhu Mahasthavir Chandramani, in which Ambedkar was joined by hundreds of thousands of his followers. 3 months later, on 6th December 1956, Ambedkar died at his residence in New Delhi. His body was conveyed to Bombay, where it was put on a funeral pyre at Dadar crematorium. Ambedkar's decision to embrace Buddhism has often been seen as a product of his disillusionment with politics. Nonetheless, after considering the connections between the ideas of Bose and Ambedkar, one may suggest that his conversion was a sort of cultural and psychological rebellion against Brahminism. It was a way to show his followers that changing their status in society was possible because there was no racial or inherent difference between them and the rest of Hindu society to prevent it. And his followers definitely failed at this. This essay argues for the importance of examining Ambedkar's career in relation to the anthropological ideas of his time. It shows him not only as an informed scholar of current Western theories, but also as a critical analyst, innovator, and practitioner of the ideas he believed in. As noted above, Ambedkar did not blindly follow the work of Bose, but transformed it to suit his political and ideological battles against untouchability. In doing so, Ambedkar made similar arguments as prominent Western academics such as Ruth Benedict and Alexander Lesser. It is important to be aware that Ambedkar's connections with anthropology do not end there. For instance, in his seminal work, The Interpretation of Cultures, Clifford Geertz drew several times on Ambedkar's conception of nationalism as a feeling of a corporate sentiment of oneness. Similarly, in Homo Hierarchicus, Louis Dumont, without acknowledging Ambedkar, defined caste as a state of mind. Louis Dumont, without acknowledging Ambedkar, defined caste as a state of mind, and Louis Dumont is the person who is mainly countered by Nicholas B. Dirks, whose paper we will... I have 2 papers that I'm going to discuss by Dirks, which I'll probably do tomorrow. And that is why the book is called The Castes of the Mind, because Louis Dumont said, without acknowledging Ambedkar, defined caste as a state of mind. While these themes will have to be developed further in the future, this essay is intended to open new paths in the debates surrounding the field of global intellectual history. I would like to thank Kama MacLean, the editor of South Asia Journal of South Asian Studies, the journal's 2 anonymous reviewers for their invaluable comments. The essay also received precious feedback from Laura Loyola, Chris Moffat, Sunil Purushottam, and Anil Varghese. All errors are mine. Disclosure statement. Funding. This article was possible due to an early career research fellowship funded by the Lever-Hulme Trust grant. Okay. Okay, nothing else to read here. Okay, now let me check some comments and then we'll go offline. Vinay Singh is saying Janki Bakle criticism of Savarkar is not legitimate and unbiased. She uses the concept of you commented that in my previous live stream as well, and I said that if you are really serious about your criticism, then don't put it in an anonymous YouTube live chat. Write a paper, write an article, send it to Op India for God's sake. But if you really think she's wrong, take it up, be serious about it, and nip her ideas in the bud so that they don't gain prominence. Any significant comments? Not Okay. M. Shastri is saying Shakta Advaitan, Shakta Brahmins who follow Puri Shankaracharya are not supposed to eat meat, they are strict vegetarians. Okay. So Shakta Brahmins who are Pandits, Pujaris and Purohits are not supposed to eat meat, right? Vegetarianism depends on the Jati Kula. Some Brahmins eat meat. I see. Acha. Some don't. Pandit Brahmins are not supposed to have meat. Okay. Nityananda Mishra had showed several times that Buddhists have caste system, but Brahmin is not on the top and is hated and badmouthed. Yeah, and we have discussed a paper on our own live stream that about casteism in Buddhism. Dada, I was hearing the argument by Kushal and Madhusudan and they agreed priests by qualification. Okay. Okay then, thank you for joining the live stream, guys. Good night. Any plans on reading Hindutva by Chandranath? Yes, in Bengali, from my Bengali channel. Possibly tomorrow, let's see. Good night, guys.